Helix Brewing Company, our friends here. Welcome to Wild Wednesdays at Helix Brewing Company. How many of you have been to some of our presentations before? I see a lot of familiar faces, so most of you here tonight, thank you for coming and doing that. So our objective in doing these is to just inspire and inform people about how to get out there responsibly and get excited about what's happening in the outdoor industry. And I am thrilled to death to be able to introduce the person tonight, because it's something that's a subject that's really near and dear to my heart, and I'll get into that in just a few minutes. When I was 14, I got involved with A16. And that was in 1970. So I had a second row seat to a lot of the things that were happening, in that real critical time in the late 60s and early 70s. And I had no idea I was kind of witnessing this new revolution of gear, and all that was changing, and all the names that were coming by, and the reps that were coming by, and the companies that were starting to grow at about that time. We were talking earlier about the John Muir Trail, and the fact that you guys, when you went in 1970, thought maybe you were the first hikers on the John Muir Trail. And when you had gone on the trail, you found out that there was a few other people doing that. But that was kind of it when A16 was coming of age too. So that was a really fun time. And Rachel, her book, of course, writes a lot about that period as well. One of the reasons that I'm so interested in history was because my uncle Mick, who had A16 for many, many years, loved history. But he was always a visionary, and I always thought that was kind of interesting. A lot of people, look back all the time, and a lot of people, don't care about the history, and they look forward. But what he taught me, without really saying these words, but was that you study history because it's fun. It's interesting to see how things happen, but it's more important than that, and that it puts the present in perspective, and it's a tool for helping to shape the future. And I learned a lot from him as I worked for him for many, many years and became his shadow, like as I said, in about 1970. And that one always stuck with me. And so as years went by, he was always telling me stories and introduced me to various people that did some few things. And I added a few contributions to myself when I ran our factory for about 15 years in the 80s and early 70s. So it's a subject that has always fascinated me. And so when I heard that about Rachel, and I met Rachel 12 years ago. She may or may not tell you the story about how we met. But I was really excited the fact that there were other people that cared about this kind of thing. And the outdoor industry since has done a great job of documenting and collecting archives to help tell the story. And when Rachel said she was going to write a book, I thought that's fantastic. And when it came out, I was thrilled because she filled in a whole lot of blanks for me, and I thought I was pretty up to speed with a lot of the history and I certainly recognized a lot of names. But thank you so much for doing such an incredible job. And if you don't have the book and you haven't bought it yet, I would really suggest that you do it. So without going on and on and on, because I wish I could, because I love the subject so much, I am very proud to introduce and welcome Rachel Gross.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you. Talking to fellow outdoor enthusiasts is such a lot of fun, and you've gotten a chance, I hope, to see some of the cool old gear. We can't cover 150 years of history in a short presentation. I think you're all probably thankful about that, especially if it's bringing back memories of the classroom that you don't want to relive. But I'll give you an overview of how I came to this topic and kind of my process of research, and then talk a bit about how A16 fits into the story of the 1970s. But I'm happy in the Q&A that follows to talk about the entire time period. So if you have questions about military gear or Teddy Roosevelt or really anything that you throw at me, I'm happy to address that as well. So I'd only been backpacking for one night in my entire life when I won a fellowship that would take me hut to hut hiking around the world for an entire year. I did this because I thought it was a really cool opportunity, and also because I hoped it would turn me into the kind of outdoors person I had always wanted to be. I thought that I could become my true self out on the trail, and I knew from years of reading Boy Scout handbooks and Boys Life magazine that the first place to go, besides to the library to get a bunch of guidebooks on all the places I would travel to, was to my local outdoor store, and that was A16 in West LA. The inspiration for this trip was partly intellectual. The history of wilderness is central to the field of environmental history, which I went on to study. People ask questions about kind of how is the idea of nature not just about what is wild, but also constructed by humans, shaped by art and by literature. But it was also a deeply personal trip. My love of the outdoors dated back to my childhood, to my family camping trips, to those Boys Life magazines that I read. When I was 10 or 11 years old, I would hold my brother's Boy Scout handbook lovingly and thumb through the pages, thinking about all those merit badges that I would earn if only they would let me into the club. I also, in history class, got introduced to the Rocky Mountain School of Painters, so think canvases like those by Albert Bierstadt of Yosemite's kind of soaring peaks and beautiful landscapes. Camping trips with my parents and siblings in Western national parks also taught me important skills like how to poke at a fire and how to kind of sleep through a very cold night. I got that kind of message not just from what I read, but also from the everyday images that were part of my life. So think things like Ansel Adams calendars that my parents had when I was a child. Those landscapes taught me about kind of the images of nature and what they had to offer to me as a person. I had applied to this post-college fellowship because I wanted to become an outdoorsy person. I thought I would become brave and self-reliant and kind of self-sufficient if only I could do kind of this kind of activity. And I wanted to become competent at managing all the details of surviving outdoors. So that's what I embarked on to do. Gripped with a desire then to exude a kind of expertise I definitely did not possess at the time, I went to A16 kind of eager to acquire all the goods that I needed in order to survive by myself out on the trail for 365 days. I went and read guidebooks, imagining what it would be like to go to Scotland's West Highland Way or climbing up Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, but I also knew I needed kind of more material objects to get me through this journey. So I acquired some new items, a new Gregory pack, 70 liters, a new down sleeping bag that was supposed to keep me warm to 15 degrees. I borrowed a whole bunch of equipment too, my brother's Boy Scout stuff that he had used. I borrowed some fleece gloves, and I also went to the store. And so as I gazed at the wall of socks, right, thinking, do I need brown ones or tan ones? Oh no, I better not pick the wrong thing. Just a week before my trip, I started thinking about kind of how I was so obsessed with getting the right stuff because I thought it would be my way of signaling that I knew what I was doing. And that to me was the first inkling I had that there was some interesting story here that I didn't fully understand at the time. I reassured myself confidently that picking the right gear in a Los Angeles store would somehow be the access to the outdoors, but also to the person I wanted to be. And that suggests that there's a whole lot of power in this kind of gear, right? And the fact that many of us are holding on to it for, decades after its last use on the trail, because it means something to us more than just its functionality. Ultimately, I chose an orange nylon rain jacket, some Capilene long underwear, and this down sleeping bag to 15 degrees. I packed all of it in my Gregory internal frame pack, confident that checking all of these boxes on the packing list would mean that I was actually ready to go. Of course, I chose wrong. My cornflower blue shirt was beautiful, but so bright and shiny, and it made it clear that I'd never even washed it before I actually went on the trail. I had more pressing concerns than my spork snapping in half. I could light my stove, but I didn't know how to fix it when it broke down. And tucked into my lime green sleeping bag every night, I was cold, and I didn't understand for months into the trip that it was actually, the problem was my sleeping pad, right? That the cold was seeping in through the ground, and my sleeping pad just wasn't thick enough to keep me warm. Worse yet, at least I thought this, backpackers that I met all around the world felt free to comment on my choices and what I was doing wrong when I was out on the trail. One of the main things I heard was, why is your pack so big? And remember, I was traveling for a year, I was by myself, and I was going to 5 different continents. So I had a really wide range of stuff to get me through. I recognized that part of this commentary was people wanting to demonstrate their superior knowledge. Like, I know what I'm doing, you're just a young woman by yourself, let me help you understand all the things you're doing wrong. But there was actually something far more interesting than just condescension in those conversations. I started to understand that people were trying to impart on me kind of their local hiking culture and saying, it's not just about what works in our region based on our weather, but also kind of, here's the aesthetics of the trail in the place that you are right now. And so, for instance, I remember the hiking pants in Switzerland, which looked like, to me, pajama pants with plaid knee patches. They looked very comfortable, but they were so different from the nylon zip-offs that were popular in the United States at the same time. And it was through insights like that one, seemingly mundane in some ways, that I started to recognize there's a story here about why I thought the packing list that I had checked off was my way into American outdoor culture, right? I thought this was the right way with a capital R. This is what I needed to get. And the stuff that I bought or borrowed was my way into that. But I learned all sorts of cultures have their own rules and aesthetics about what it means to be in the woods, to get back to nature, to explore the wilderness. And I wanted to understand the American version of that story. Over the course of my year, I grew stronger shouldering my, yes, too heavy pack. I learned how to fix my stove so I didn't have to eat granola for dinner. And I became more confident on the trail. Over many miles, I reflected on this question of why I thought acquiring a certain set of camping gear would turn me into a certain kind of person. Where did my packing list come from? As it turned out, these questions would shape my academic research for the next decade and beyond. The year after my great adventure, I began graduate school in Madison, Wisconsin, happy for a while to be writing about mountains rather than climbing in them. Though I still hiked and dabbled in other sports, I didn't become a wilderness guide or park ranger, which is what my teenage self had imagined would be the ideal path that I would take. Instead, I became a specialist in the meanings that Americans attach to their outdoor experiences. So I'm the first person to claim the title of a historian of the outdoor gear industry. And I hope I'm not the last person to do that. And that means I ask questions about not just what do people buy and how does this technology change over time, questions that I do answer in my book, but also what meanings did people attach to it? Why do they love it so much? And what kind of people did they think they became when they acquired these goods? I combined what I learned in school with my personal reflection. So I studied things like the cultural constructions of manhood in the 19th century, or the evolution of modernity and how people kind of grappled with what they thought was modernization. But I combined that with my own experiences walking down a trail, kind of being concerned about my consumption habits and what I thought this gear said about me, to create this history of 150 years of American outdoor industry history that's focused both on industry professionals, so outdoor companies and retailers, but also on the consumers themselves who are a part of building this culture. For this history of the outdoor industry, I looked at a really wide variety of archives. This is me at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I consulted historical documents like catalogs from ducksbacks in the early 20th century, guidebooks like Mountaineering Freedom of the Hills from the 1950s, and DuPont advertisements from the 1980s. So in that, you can already hear there's a really wide range of kind of characters and companies that appear in this material. I visited the archives of outdoor companies, viewing materials that historians had never looked at, such as the old catalogs and advertisements from A16. I accessed those because Terry Embry and John let me into what I remember as a back closet where there was just a bunch of stuff piled up on shelves. It wasn't in any order, which again, to a historian is actually really exciting. Like, oh, nobody's really looked at this seriously, but there's such treasures, right? In terms of the stories, the community represented there that I got a chance to witness. I also was the first researcher to go to W.L. Gore and Associates out in Delaware. They had never had an academic researcher, and the creators of Gore-Tex, of course, also had a really big influence on American outdoor culture of the last 50 plus years. I complemented this research with an examination of actual stuff. I'm sure that this audience can imagine that though looking at old backpacker magazines or advertisements is really telling, right? You can get a sense of outdoor culture from that. It's not the same thing as actually holding a Trapper Nelson pack in your hand and understanding just how heavy it was, right? Or seeing the first generation of the Gore-Tex jacket and noticing how it was disintegrating, right? The story of Gore-Tex on paper is that it was a wild success from its introduction in 1976, but in fact, the first generation of Gore-Tex didn't work well at all, and most people returned their jackets. And so looking at stuff, right, not just reading documents, is a way into understanding that complex history of technological failure alongside successes. There we go. Jumping forward here. I also interviewed outdoor enthusiasts who showed me their gear closets. This is crucial because one of the things I'm so interested in is this question of what kind of meaning do people attach to their gear. And from Teddy Roosevelt on to the baby boomer outdoor enthusiasts of the second half of the 20th century, there are really interesting stories that you get at if you go beyond just the marketing, right? Just the kind of public-facing materials coming out of companies. So some interesting stories include the fact that Teddy Roosevelt, who for some is an icon of the kind of rugged West and the do-it-yourself and woodcraft ethic of the late 19th century, didn't make his own buckskin jacket. He actually purchased it from a Native American woman, as did most white outdoorsmen of the late 19th century, even though the guidebook suggested that if you want to do it right, you got to make it yourself. Similarly, I talked to people like Sally Wright, who is a Montana hiker and backpacker, now in her late 80s, and she talked about the Frostline DIY kits that she sewed not just for herself, but as gifts for her entire family. And understanding kind of her experience of putting that together, what meaning she attached to it, and why she saved her Frostline bag after 50 years and said, hey, this is pretty good, I did a great job, is a really important part of the story because it means you can get at something that's not represented in advertisements by themselves. To trace the role of the military in the industry and of the industry in the US military, I also looked at government documents, so military records from World War II. And I didn't just tell the story of ski troopers from the 10th Mountain Division, although that's fun and pretty interesting. I looked at the much larger collection of the Quartermaster Corps, which is the part of the US military responsible for kind of clothing and equipment. And what I learned is that the outdoor industry had a really important role in shaping the new design of military uniforms and equipment during World War II, and they brought a lot of the insights of military scientific testing back with them to the industry in the decades that followed. And so that wasn't something I was expecting, right? Here is this outdoor enthusiast who was trying to write about people who go hiking, but I ended up in the National Archives reading about the US military and their testing facilities. But I was so surprised at the really wide reach and influence that the outdoor industry had had. That too is a part of this story. This book introduces new characters alongside famous figures from the outdoor past. So there are businesses that you likely have heard of, like Abercrombie & Fitch, though you may not associate them with American outdoor outfitters. They were one of the foremost outfitters of the early 20th century. I also talk about 100-year-old businesses that are still popular, like Eddie Bauer and LL Bean. There are gear makers like Alice Holubar and Mary Anderson, who were an important part of shaping the industry in the middle of the century and whose names I hope will become better known. In addition to famous contemporary gear company owners, there are also people who are famous for climbing mountains. So think Everest climber and REI manager Jim Whittaker, who kind of will show up in our story in just a little while. But there are also people who were famous and who liked to climb mountains. So Robert Redford, too, is a part of this book, in part because he chose the college he wanted to go to, not based on the mountains of Boulder, but the fact that Holubar Mountaineering ran a shop in Boulder, and he read about that mythical space and said, I want to go to school where this outdoor gear shop is, right? So there's a really wide range of characters. But most of the people who show up in this story are ordinary consumers. This is Sally Wright. Pennsylvania hunter Harold Bomberger in the 1920s wrote about acquiring a plaid wool white stag cruiser, so a really heavy hunting jacket, and he wrote about it to all of his friends, right? This is something that we might feel is a little bit familiar 100 years later. You acquire something cool and new and you want to tell people about how great it is. Similarly, not just Sally Wright, but her contemporary Montana hiker Christy Dubois sewed herself a Frostline DIY jacket. These experiences of industry professionals and outdoor consumers are at the core of the story because ultimately they are the ones who help to create outdoor culture. That's Christy with her jacket. I didn't realize until many years after my backpacking adventure around the world that many of the items that I bought for my trip had their origins in US military testing facilities. I didn't understand the history of the synthetic fibers that were a part of my long underwear that I took for granted had their own history when it came to collaboration between chemical companies such as DuPont and 3M and the outdoor industry in the 1970s and 1980s. I hadn't also considered how the prohibitive cost of outdoor gear, which was paid for in my case through the generous support of this fellowship that I won, as well as the mystique that I had from the borrowed goods that I got from people, necessarily excluded whole swaths of people who didn't have access to the same kind of products. I shared this ignorance about my pack's backstory with most outdoor enthusiasts who, as you likely know, number in the tens of millions in the United States. In the 21st century, as in the 150 previous years, Americans have learned to feel most themselves by the river, at a campsite, climbing up the mountains. And for each one of the trips that they take, their afternoon mountain biking, their family fly fishing trip, they stop at the store first. This is, of course, because there is necessary equipment that we need to do these activities. You can't go mountain biking if you don't have a bike to ride. So I'm not questioning that. But Americans are also hoping that the products that fill their backpacks or their canoes or their panniers will open up the way to some kind of authentic experience. Shopping All the Way to the Woods is written for gear lovers by a gear lover, explaining where all of these goods come from and just why they ended up on Americans' packing lists. So that's an introduction to how I came to write this book, and I'm going to talk a bit about, as I suggested, A16 and how it fits into the history of the 1970s outdoor industry. Besides this image looking kind of a little nostalgic and funny, I think there's something really important going on in this image of a catalog from 50 years ago. Outdoor branded t-shirts in the 1970s became an important emblem of outdoor identity in the 1970s. This doesn't seem remarkable in some ways to 21st century audiences where we all sport, well, I guess many of us sport t-shirts from our favorite brewery or outdoor brand without thinking much about it, right? There's logos here or wherever you might put them on a shirt, and that's just a part of what we wear. But t-shirts were a newer kind of style 50 years ago. People had only just begun wearing them as outerwear. And wearing branded t-shirts was a part of embracing not just a company, but an entire identity, right? Being a part of a specific community. In earlier chapters, before I cover the 1970s, I write about places like Holly Bar Mountaineering and Jerry Mountain Sports based in Boulder, and how they worked to create a sense of cohesive outdoor community through the personal connections that the gear makers who owned these companies had with their outdoor consumers who shopped there. So, for instance, I write about Gil Roberts, who was a part of the 1963 Everest expedition, who wrote to Alice Holly Bar herself and said, okay, I heard you made a jacket for someone else, and he sketched out, I want my jacket to look like that, but here's the different specifications I'd like, can you make it for me? He personally knew Alice Hollybar, and he wanted this jacket because he associated her with outdoor expertise. That kind of personal connection was increasingly not possible as outdoor recreation became more and more popular in the late 60s and 1970s, right? In Boulder, there were maybe 1,000 climbers and mountaineers who they were catering to in the 1950s, but we're talking about millions of people by the 1970s who wanted to be a part of this world, and new outdoor companies couldn't maintain that personal touch that they once had. So the outdoor t-shirt with its very prominent branding is a good example of how companies responded to this newfound interest. They worked to create a sense of community, even though people couldn't always be personally connected to the one making their gear as they had been a few decades earlier. Some of the fashions that people might like from this era involve a lot of kind of burnt orange and deep yellows and browns, the beautiful colors of this time period. In addition, some of the notable things that I talk about elsewhere in the book include a surprising and brief popularity of lederhosen and Austrian feathered caps that places like Hollybar, Jerry, but also REI, the co-op, sold to American hikers and mountaineers. I think that a lot of people embrace these styles, in part because they represented kind of an alpine aesthetic, of course, but also a Northern European outdoor expertise that Americans were hoping to embrace themselves. So that's part of the kind of pre-story before we get to places like A16 and the branded t-shirts. I write about A16 in the context of other new companies of this time period and the reluctant businessmen who are at their heads. This is a term that I draw from the Patagonia kind of business self-help memoir and history of the company by Yvon Chouinard. And I think it's important because it reflects a certain kind of environmental politics and ethics of the 1970s that doesn't come around again for many decades. A lot of people, and Mick Mead absolutely is included in this group, started to reflect on the fact that if they were working in the outdoor industry, they were helping to increase access to the outdoors by saying, here's all the stuff that you need. It's going to be warmer and comfortable than you thought. And also, they started to wring their hands and say, gosh, the products that I'm selling, often derived from petrochemicals, might have a negative environmental impact. And also, I am personally responsible for bringing more and more crowds of people into my beloved places. What do I do with that kind of conundrum? Mick Mead wrote about this in an issue of Footprints, where he was reflecting on the fact that he was excited about the opportunity he had to invite people into this space, but also a little bit concerned about what the larger impact would have. The founders of JanSport and Patagonia also were reflecting on similar kinds of issues. One answer to this question was to help build a new kind of community. It wasn't based on those personal connections with the person who sewed your jacket, because it was just not the scale that was possible during this time period. A16 helped to pioneer new forms of this that will be familiar to many of you in this room. One of the things was kind of education courses, right? Like taking a class about the skills of backpacking or what to pack for your next trip, but doing it inside of the store where part of the education comes from what's on the shelves behind you, right? You're listening to the person who works for the retailer, learning those lessons, but also being a part of a larger group. Something else were the publications that went along with all of this material. Footprints is not unusual in that there were lots of other outdoor retailers and catalog companies at the time that were publishing not just catalogs of goods, but also pushing a new outdoor ethic, right? This is the time period where people are switching over from the kind of heavier kind of Boy Scout method of building a campfire every time you go out backpacking in the woods to thinking, oh, maybe we should bring camp stoves instead, right? So there's a shift in ideas about the right way to get back to nature and what kinds of equipment goes along with that. That goes alongside technological transformations and the synthetic revolutions of the same time period. In educational pamphlets like this one, in small magazines, outdoor retailers were at the center of this education about the new outdoor ethic. And so people were getting not just stuff, but also these really important ideas about how to do the outdoors and what outdoor culture was from the materials that they read. Finally, you probably all have heard or attended a swap meet. A16 is a great example of this, but there are many more, including the co-op in Seattle ran kind of owner sales at the same time period. These were important not just because it meant that people could have access to cheaper gear that someone else had used, but also because of the connections that people formed. I read a lot about people waiting at 6 a.m. in the parking lot, holding their steaming coffee, kind of making chit-chat with the people around them as they waited for the sale to actually start. This is crucial, right? Because it's not just about gear exchange. It's about the connections, the sharing of knowledge, and building a bit of that mystique in the products, the same kind of feeling that I felt when I got my friend's old fleece gloves, right? Yeah, they kept my hands warm, but actually it was about all of the places that she had been before she passed them on to me. And that's part of the connection that was going on at swap meets like the ones that A16 hosted. John shared a couple of these great images with me when I did research at the headquarters 12 years ago, and I used some of them in my book because they are so great. These are from a little bit later than the time period we're talking about, which you can tell from the outfits, but I think they capture a lot of what's so powerful about this seemingly mundane consumer activity. It's the people talking to each other, right? People are getting gear, but they're focusing not on the trail out there, but actually the retail environment and the connections they have with other consumers and people who are selling their products. This is a crucial part of creating that new ethos of the outdoors at a time when people are often feeling disconnected from where the products that they buy are coming from. That's another picture of it. One of the final ways that I think outdoor stores, catalogs, and retailers help to create this sense of community was by doing education through how they put their catalogs together themselves. Sierra Designs had a particularly lovely set of catalogs in the mid-1970s, often hand-drawn with full of watercolors. But one of the things that the company owners talked about was how they applied their environmental values to how they assembled their catalog. They didn't want to have a negative impact by sending people to a far-flung location to take photographs, so they thought of other ways that they might lessen their impact but still get across the kind of import and the use of these products. And so all of these things might seem like, in some senses, small answers to that very big question of how do we reconcile two opposing kind of issues, right? Increasing access and not increasing access at all. But I think they're really interesting answers that people came up with 50 years ago that a lot of outdoor companies are only now starting to reflect on once again. The concern that Mick Mead expressed in Footprints is echoed in lots of other outdoor materials from the same time period. One Step at a Time, Colin Fletcher's guidebook are also really good examples of this, where the authors talk about their concern of what does it mean if we are a part of the problem, right? If we are illustrating with such vivid detail and great acclaim these places that we love so much that people are going to want to follow in our footsteps. You can see that attitude reflected in this next image. Where did all these damn hikers come from is what Harvey Manning, or the cartoon version of him, asks as he peers over the edge at all the people who follow in the wake of reading his book, One Step at a Time, which explains exactly how to acquire all the goods that you need and how to plan your trip. Right, so he, like Mick Mead, like many others, are thinking about how to be responsible in their participation in this consumer world and still kind of make their own living, but do justice to the places that they love. I go on in the longer chapter to talk a bit about some of the other approaches that companies take, including organizing trash pickups. This was the REI Co-op, write-in campaigns for political issues like preservation of wilderness. And I think those are also notable answers that go beyond the scope of just what happens in the store itself. This is a good example of the Footprints equivalent from REI, but these two reflect that building of community that I think is really important. And here you can see some of the environmental messaging coming out of the co-op's answer to the Footprints magazine, where you get a sense of this goes far beyond stuff. Right? This isn't just about what is the latest and greatest backpack and why do you need to make the switch over to internal frame, which you do, right? There are some really deep issues that retail stores, outdoor industry professionals are at the forefront of educating a broader public about. I think that's remarkable because I don't see the parallels in many other industries for a few decades after that. And I teach business history to my students over in Colorado. And so part of what I'm interested in here is kind of how there is an outlier, right, in the outdoor world in some ways that we can all learn from. So I hope by now, and I'll be finishing up in a minute, we can do some Q&A, that you're getting a sense of why putting on a Marmot Mountain t-shirt or an A16 t-shirt in the early 1970s is far more powerful than just covering your torso so you don't get a sunburn. There's something really deeply powerful about people claiming that their identity is linked to that of a store, right? Because it represents more than just the acquisition of goods. It's about community, it's about education, and it's about a new outdoor ethic that people were very proud to be a part of. In the longer book, I go on to talk about the transformation of the outdoor world in the decades that follow this era. So I talk about kind of the rise of synthetic materials and how that corporatization of the outdoors reshapes a lot of this kind of effort, which is mostly grassroots. I talk about the shift towards outdoor lifestyle, where outdoor companies are concerned, once again, not about the environmental harms that they're doing, but the fact that they're selling to ordinary people who might be using their equipment to walk their dog rather than climbing up a mountain, right? So kind of the hand-wringing shifts in terms of the tone and the focus that industry has when it comes to thinking about the outdoor market. But that self-reflection, the kind of consideration of where the industry has been and where it's going, is a consistent part of the story in the decades that follow this one. But I want to leave us here thinking about how all of you have decided to come to this community event, right, to reconnect with each other, to reflect a bit on the beloved gear that either you have in your, your attic or your garage, or you wish you had kept and you're ruefully thinking about it, and to consider some of the stories that you personally attach to those items. What do you think those products say about you? How do they reconnect you to fond memories or memories of horrific nights out where you wish you were actually back at home? And what do they say about you as a person? Ultimately, that's where this book goes. It's not a suggestion of here's the best stuff, right? I don't leave you with a packing list of now I've learned you should definitely pack this and not that. I don't do that. It's also not an industry screed, right? I'm not here to take down any one company and say their stuff actually isn't really good products. Instead, I'm here to push all of us to think more deeply about the narratives, the stories that we tell, and why we attach such power to beloved objects like this one. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I very much count myself among this crowd of people who love gear and who want to keep telling these stories. Thank you all. So as I suggested, I imagine there are things that we can talk about related to A16 itself, but obviously the book is national in scope, sometimes international, and it covers 150 years of history from the Civil War to the present. So if there's anything that you're interested in from the other eras that I didn't cover here, I'm so delighted to answer questions about them, or to hear your stories, of course.
An interesting story is that Lou Whitaker, who was Jim's brother, Everest expedition and all that. He was recruited to train 10th Mountain Division troops in Colorado. And my wife's father was trained by Lou in the 10th Mountain Division. And it's just the way, when I found out, when Luke recently passed away, I found out that he did that. I kind of went full circle and made sure that he was there. I was like, that's interesting.
Yeah, so that comment was about kind of Lou Whitaker, like another famous climber and guide, and his role in the training of ski troopers in the 10th Mountain Division at Camp Hale. One of the interesting things I learned about the 10th Mountain Division is not just that what other historians have shown is that the ski troopers had a really important influence on the post-war ski industry and were responsible for its spread, especially in Colorado, but certainly nationwide. But also, they shaped the outdoor industry and even the world of athleisure, right? The ski troopers had tremendous reach in the decades that followed World War II. And that's in part because they were kind of an elite outfit when they were kind of recruited because they were elite athletes that already had experience in these areas in some cases. But Jerry Cunningham was a teenage 10th Mountain Division ski trooper sitting in his tent thinking, this gear is horrible, I can design better. And he would draw designs of teardrop packs that he would go on to produce in the years that followed. And there were many others like him. Even his tent mate was a part of the outdoor industry in the years that followed. And that's part of the story here, is that it's not just the ski industry, it's the outdoor industry as a whole, particularly with a focus on equipment. And it's not because the military had such great stuff. Despite all that scientific testing I talked about, mostly it didn't work very well, or it never reached the soldiers on the front. So a lot of the inspiration came from the inadequacy of military equipment and clothing, and that inspired kind of innovation and redesigns. People like Alice Hollybar, who said, I can do much better than this, and she went on to do just that. Yeah.
I appreciate you telling about your encounter with A16 in Santa Monica, West Side. I have very fond memories of that story too. When I was at UCLA grad school, I would procrastinate and go there and just walk around and have dreams of what I would use this equipment for. And then it was wonderful when I moved to San Diego to do the same thing here. So I want to just say we really missed the physical store and everything that represented beyond the the physical object.
One of the so that's really interesting. One of the things that's so consistent in the documents that I read is that even 100 years ago, people were reflecting on the fact that how in the wintertime, they would thumb through their guidebook, their recollections from their summertime adventures, the catalogs if they received them, and think about what they needed to acquire, what they wanted to fix, and kind of manage their gear closets. And so even kind of this turn of the 20th century guidebook author was saying like, okay, my wife hates it, but I have this whole closet of gear and it's just for me. And yeah, I know I don't need it all, but I just can't get rid of any of it. And it felt so familiar to me. I had expected in some ways that in this story, I would find a time period that was a little bit less consumed with gear, right? Like that was like more about outdoors itself and somehow not about the world of consumption. But in fact, that's not the story that I found. Even in the 1880s, American outdoor enthusiasts were thinking with worry, like, what if I'm wearing my buckskin suit wrong and people know that I'm a greenhorn, right? Which is, their word for beginner, right? So in other words, kind of not just this notion of like, I'm gonna spend my off time away from the trail dreaming about all the ways that I can acquire more or fix what I have or be back there, but also that it's a very consistent thread throughout this whole history that made me feel kind of kin with these people from generations ago. The cost question is a really important one because it comes up in the historical documents as well. A good example of this is Alice and Roy Holubar of Holubar Mountaineering sent some of their sleeping bags and other kit to the American National Exhibition in Moscow in 1958 or 59. So this is the same time, this is the kitchen debate, right? Khrushchev and Nixon talking about which kitchen is better for housewives. But at the same time, right, we also had our like outdoor gear as an emblem of American nature. But the stuff that they sent, though it's evidence of this kind of craft home-based economy, also costs in the equivalent of contemporary dollars, $1,000 per sleeping bag, right? So it's actually incredibly high-end and inaccessible goods that served as one of the emblems of American consumer culture that I think adds an interesting twist to this notion of kind of the mass market American consumer kitchen, right, that should be available to every housewife, which at least is the messaging kind of that the national government would have liked to push at the time.
For now, we're always thinking cost per ounce. Mm-hmm. How much does it cost to reduce your ounces? Which is kind of the interesting over accumulating as years go by. I pay more to reduce the ounces.
Right, which is it's partly a generational question in the sense of my back also hurts. So I think deeply about that. And the fact that actually pack weight recommendations have remained fairly consistent for 100 years, with the exception of ultralight, which I'll talk about in a minute, in the sense that, 100 years ago, guidebook authors and kind of outdoor retail stores are saying, really try to keep it under 30, and in 1980, they're also saying that even with all the advent of all the new equipment, right? Because as we know, the more lightweight, cool stuff that's gonna make your experience better, the more it turns out you have on your packing list, right? Because you're not bringing a can of beans, but rather like a whole camp kitchen. As I mentioned, the exception is ultra lightweight backpacking. I don't write about that in the book, but I have an article about that, which is focused on the way that it was actually consumers who were at the kind of the center of the innovation in the ultra lightweight world in the 90s and early 2000s as a part of the internet communities, the listservs, right, that they were posting on, sharing information about kind of fabrics that they would get from sailing that weren't available commercially yet in outdoor stores. And I think that's a really remarkable example of the ways that community continues to be at the center of kind of where a lot of this gear is coming from or how it gets pushed forward. So, yeah.
It's being older, my philosophy is like, I'll carry a little extra weight to make sure I have a safety factor built in, I'm more comfortable, and so on and so forth. Because, I work at REI, we got those featherweight tents now, they don't weigh anything. Of course, they're $500 for a tent that weighs as much as a napkin, but we get those things in for repair all the time because they thin out those poles so much and light them up. The ferrules are always splitting on them. So there's a, ultralight, but it's actually not better. Mm-hmm. But the manufacturers are convincing people that you have to go that way, and I think it's a false sense of being better.
Yeah, and my research is less about kind of innovation and first, like who invented this thing first, right? I think there are some interesting places where you can read about that. And it's far more about why do people think they need a certain thing, right? And so that's actually the interesting question, because the rules are changing all the time. There's lots of cool innovations that have happened, but the harder question to get at is where did these rules come from, right? Not the stuff, but like the ideas behind it, the culture that it represents. It's really hard to grasp. Like we're all living it and feeling it, but it's not necessarily written down, and I hope I've captured some aspect of that. Questions from other folks who haven't said anything yet?
Yeah, so just along the lines of talking about community sourced and the reasons why, I hope there's a bunch of Girl Scout backpackers here. Now we're really proud of our legacy and hardly anyone knows about it. And so I hope people do wander over there. It was a camp nurse that invented, or one of the people, or did invent one of the first lightweight 2-pole backpacking tents. And it was because she had to get her girls out and they were carrying canvas and pole tents. And so she created this lightweight ripstop nylon, which was new at the time, and sourced at UFO Fabrics in South Bay here, and used arrow shafts for the poles because they were lightweight, so all these girls could get out. And Andy Drollinger was helping her with those ferrules that you're talking about that would hold the arrow shafts together. And it's exactly what you're talking about. This is why. She had a group of bandy backpackers that she wanted to get out. She created this tent. She shared the pattern widely with Girl Scouts, with Boy Scouts, with the Sierra Club at the time. And this was we know in the 60s it started, and maybe before that, we don't really know when exactly it started. But kind of what you're talking about. That's a why. That's a why. I got to get these girls out, and we got to make our packs light. And so I'm going to design a tent that helps them get out. And and so if you haven't read it, she shared her pattern with A16 at the time, and they took it and made some modifications, and they were the first to market it, which is a big deal, is the A16 half dome tent.
Everyone should check out the yellow tent over there. It's not a quilt, it looks like a quilt.
Yes. Was that one of the first ones?
1965.
Or
So
the first
we know when that was.
We have a picture of 66. We know they started teaching the tent class at Girl Scouts in 65, and Bandy was doing it before that, so we don't have the exact date.
Though I just have learned about this, one of the things that reminds me of is the community of sewers that were created around the Frostline and other companies, and there were more than 12 at the height of it, doing DIY kits in the 1970s. And part of what Frostline helped to create was, if people are going to sew this, they're going to need help. So they eventually storefronts, not just catalogs, where people could go bring their kit in, sew it there and get help, or they could call the helpline, right? Which is a good suggestion that we're not just limiting ourselves to kind of this imagined textual connection where you pick up the catalog, you think like, I'm sure other people are reading this, I'm a part of that group, right? No, you actually need that personal connection, because it turns out, I mean, as someone who doesn't know how to sew at all, right? I didn't take home economics. I wouldn't have been able to do that. For people who have some skill but who needed the assistance, there was once again support, right, that had to build up alongside the kind of company itself. Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about the military style tent, please, and maybe the buckskin jacket?
Sure. Like a historian, I'll go chronologically. The buckskin jacket, it reflects this era in the late 19th century, though this is a much older, newer jacket, where the woodcraft ethos, right, making everything that you need using nature as a storehouse, was the predominant idea about how to equip yourself for the outdoors. So guidebooks were saying, don't trust those shifty shopkeepers, right? They're just going to tell you to buy things you don't need. If you really need something, you should be building it yourself. Right, you should make your bed out of tree branches. You should build a fire out in the woods. Don't buy stuff, you gotta make it. And that included the buckskin jacket, right? Shoot the deer, tan the hide, and make your own buckskin. Though the ethos was there in the guidebooks and how people talked about their outdoor experiences, what I found in my research is that most men actually purchased their buckskin suits from Native American women. right, like Teddy Roosevelt. And that suggests that there's a disconnect between this ideal and then the practical realities that people didn't have the skill or the time to do the work by themselves, but they still push this notion of kind of pride in their craft and doing it all themselves and the fierce independence that that would represent that I see echoed through lots of different generations that follow. Buckskin eventually transforms by the 1920s and 1930s to things like buckskein, which is a cotton or wool jacket that was manufactured by Nash, Lustberg & Co., a New York-based company, I think out of Utica, New York. Anyway, they eventually were sued by the FTC because they kept trying to sell this leather fabric as buckskin, just like with a slightly different branding. And it reflects the shift in consumers' notion of what's authentic, what's going to protect them out in nature, and kind of how do they know what they're buying when they look at these advertisements. So buckskin, the jacket itself is interesting, but it leads us into a whole bunch of other stories about men's notion of expertise and belonging, of Native American histories embodied in certain material objects, and eventually the material transformations of ready-to-wear industries of clothing in the early 20th century. Military equipment during World War II. The mountain tent that the ski troopers of the 10th Mountain Division used was often heralded as a really innovative and exciting new development. It was lightweight, it worked effectively with high winds. It was so much better than the pup tent, kind of like that half shelter that we often imagine. That was far more widely distributed in the years after World War II. There weren't that many of them manufactured, and so often people who were buying military surplus in the years that followed the war were searching around for those treasures like the mountain tent. They didn't want a pup tent. You could buy that anywhere, right? They wanted the good stuff that the ski troopers had access to, and that's one of the ways kind of that I was able to trace people's obsession with like culling through all of the junk in order to find the treasures that they were searching for. I think that the mountain tent, like all of the other equipment that was developed during the war, is a good representation of both the promise and the limitations of U.S. military innovations and the kind of slowness and inefficiencies of bureaucracy. Because, as I mentioned, a lot of people who this was designed for, the soldiers on the front, didn't actually get this stuff shipped to them in time for it to be of any use. Some did, but a lot didn't because they were spending 1943 and 44 in wind tunnels, in laboratories stateside, figuring out what was the very best thing rather than manufacturing. The other important part of the tent story is that a lot of mountaineers and climbers especially were hearing whispers of the promise of new equipment just like that during the war and writing about all of the cool stuff that was going to be able to be accessible to civilians in the years that followed. So the American Alpine Journal in 1946 published an issue focused on the war, and it had short articles from a lot of different climbers, mostly who had worked either directly in the military or served as civilian expert consultants for the Quartermaster Corps. And a lot of them were talking about all the cool stuff. They included a photo of the mountain tent and a bunch of other equipment. But it turns out it would take years for people to have access to the kind of innovations the tent represented because, again, there just weren't enough of them for the demand that existed. But there were a lot of people who were itching to get their hands on it, and that helped to kind of whet their appetite and suggested that there was going to be a much larger market, as indeed did develop in the years that followed the war. I could do that for most of the equipment, but I won't do that for everything. I just could. Other questions? Yeah, Brian.
You said you wrote an article
Yeah.
on ultralight?
Yeah.
Where do you want to?
Yeah, so like many academics, I write different kinds of things, book and popular articles, all of which are on my website, which is my name, rachel-gross.com. So that's an academic article. You could just email me directly to get access, because often those are paywalled. There's other, though, popular and free, articles online about the history of national parks, about the history. Somebody mentioned a bit earlier in a conversation the kitty carriers, like the things we use to carry our babies and small children, about the origins of those and their development. So like it's a range of materials. The book is where a lot of the stories are, but there's, as you all have heard, like, oh, this makes me think of this and that. It's not in there, but I want to tell more of these stories, and this has come up too. Something that happened over the course of the decade plus I was doing this work is that many more companies and people recognize there's really important histories here to preserve. And that means that more companies have created archives. And also, there is now at Utah State University in Logan, Utah, an outdoor recreation archive focused on the outdoor industry. And that means that kind of as a researcher, I now have a place to turn to if I'm like, oh, I want to tell the story of kind of consumer participation and innovation, and women's role in the founding of kind of new technologies in the outdoor industry. I'd go to Logan to this archive, right, and look at the documents that people here have donated to try and tell that story. And so that means that kind of other academic researchers, I hope in the years that follow, will expand on the things that I've been talking about here, complicate them and tell them with more nuance, because there's a lot more that I don't even know about, but even things that I think, oh, I wish I could have fit it in, right? And so I hope that there is more of this kind of stories popping up everywhere as people are prompted to think of them from this research and with others.
So would you say a word about Chase's podcast and how they can access?
Sure.
Access that.
Yeah, the podcast associated with the Outdoor Recreation Industry Archive, it's linked to Utah State University's Highlander podcast. Chase Anderson is my friend and the host. And also, it's part of a really interesting degree program. For that one is outdoor products design and development. But this is not unusual. Also, since I have started this work, there have been all of these new programs, mostly in the American West, but not exclusively, focused on some aspect of the industry, right? So there's now a reflection, there's specialized training that people who want to work in this world and support the many tens of millions of us who enjoy it, that it is going forward that I think is doing interesting things when it comes to kind of the education of the next set of industry professionals. The reason I think this matters in terms of the history is that there isn't necessarily a reflection on where have we come from, right? What are the outdoor clubs we've been a part of, the organizations that have supported all these leisure activities. I hope my book is a part of that contribution, but I think there are other ways to reflect on where are there histories that we ought to be telling more of. The Highlander podcast is a good example of this, but I think there can be more, and I hope other people are thinking about ways to be involved in that too.
As I look around this room, I would guess that the average age here is about 30 or so.
Put your glasses on.
I'm interested as a professor at University of Colorado in Denver. What do the young folks think about this? Do you talk to them about these? I'm assuming you do. What are they interested or?
Yeah, I would say mostly no, but not in a critical way. I actually think the most important issue that college students are talking about has to do with access to the outdoors and increasing the diversity of the industry, which I think is incredibly promising, right? These histories can support that kind of broader effort. For those of you who have younger relatives or friends, the Watson Fellowship, Thomas J. Watson, founder of IBM, funds this fellowship that is pursuing an independent project that includes travel around the world for 40 students every year who are graduating from small liberal arts colleges. Which means that though I focused on, my project was called Mountain Hut Systems and the Meaning of Wilderness. So I went hut to hut hiking to try and understand how do other countries' kind of recreational systems work, what are the experiences tourists have. People pursue all sorts of projects like horse training techniques in Iceland and Mongolia and Brazil, or kind of like skateboarding culture in East Asian cities, where personal interests aligns with this kind of independent travel. This is relevant because one stipulation of the fellowship is you don't have to create anything. It's to become a citizen of the world, not to make an academic product. So I have this many pages of journals that I've never reread from my time. And I think a lot of it, I would say, was all about how hard it was and how lonely I was, and less about what is the meaning of wilderness. Because I was 22 and I was, by myself. But I think in part I've resisted rereading because it's possible. I'm sure we've all read outdoor memoirs of different kinds, travel memoirs, things like that, to kind of narrowly encapsulate what an experience means years later that isn't necessarily reflective of the feeling we attach to it. And so I'm just saying that to say I don't know if I want to go back yet, because I think it might narrow my vision of what that year meant. Because I have this, of course, pat and very neat narrative of here's how it shaped my intellectual journey, which it absolutely did, because people did say, why is your pack so big, right? And that shaped me in some meaningful way. But I think there's so much more about my personal development that maybe is interesting to others beyond my mom, maybe, right? But the thing is, kind of, it's like whenever you think about a memory, you're sort of shaping it at the same time, or you have a photograph and you kind of lose the edges of what else happened that day. Where I think historical documents, even my journals from that year, it is a way in, but it's also a way of limiting what the story is and what it means to me. And so I haven't decided if it actually is interesting to anyone. So like maybe, sure. But I think it does that question makes me think about all these documents that I have access to tell these stories of people who I don't know, whose stories I want to represent responsibly and well, and tell in a compelling way, where this is the very best that I could do, right? Or this is the book, right? With all the documents I could find in all these archives around the country, and it's still limited, right? Because we are such complicated, full beings with these, lives that aren't captured by documents and photographs alone. And so, like, I think about how do you do justice to any one of these things? Writing is one way to do that. There's different, media you can use, audio or video, right, to kind of approach that. And also, none of them capture who we are kind of in real life, which is why, like, just to end on this note of community, I think figuring out how to express some of these stories together to reflect with other people is one of the best ways to do this work. It's part of why that year is so weird for me, because I was alone, so there was nobody there to talk with, right? If we have shared our stories, our time on the trail, our lives with other people, having that form of connection is a way to kind of make real what I've done in this history book and keep it going. Thank you all for your comments and questions. I would love not to carry back to Colorado this pile of books. So if you would like one, I'm very happy to sign it. So let me know. Otherwise, thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah.
Outstanding job. It's all the way from Colorado on our own nickel. So thank you for coming down and doing this.
Yeah.
I loved your last slide talking about T-shirts, and so I have to do a commercial.
Yeah. Get in there.
A little known story is that I used to come down and spend the summers being my uncle's shadow at 14 till 18 or so, until I got out of college and came down and started working for him full time. But in the winters, I lived in Idaho. And so I started, and I knew that the T-shirts were kind of cool, and so this is a T-shirt that I made back in 1972. And so, I put the A16 logo on it, and there's John Muir himself on the back. This one was made a week ago by me. So I started a little company making T-shirts for A16, and so that was the beginning of my business life. And so I brought a collection of those back, and they're available at adventure16.com. So that's what I'm doing these days, is just T-shirts and hats and fun things, to keep the memory of A16 alive, keep that spirit alive. It gives me an excuse to do things like this. So on any given afternoon, my wife can tell you, when I get kicked out of the house, I go into my retirement and I silk screen a few T-shirts. So you can see they're not up there yet because they're just this particular collection is just coming out, but it's kind of fun, and it helps me remember too. So, Rachel, excellent job. We don't have to be out of here until 9, so you're welcome to come up and buy a book and ask some more questions, and look at some of the archives. So, thank you all for your interest, and thank you for coming. And Rachel, thank you again. Oh, and one more thing. I do want to give a shout out to Mike Moriarty. Mike is A16's Trail Angel filmmaker. Many of you recognize him from the other presentations. He's making a documentary about A16. He interviewed Rachel before her performance or her presentation today. If you missed one of the presentations we've had, you can go on the Adventure16 site, click on videos, and you can watch all Mike's, get the connection to YouTube from there. So thank you, Mike, for what you do on that. Just, it's a labor of love for him. Passion project. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Buy a book.